Hi, this is Dr. Thomas Armstrong. Welcome to week 10, the last week of my course, Introduction to Neurodiversity. In this module, we're going to be doing a little bit of summing up. Well, actually, what I'm going to be doing is first taking a big picture look at neurodiversity, a macro view, and that'll be a very short part of the presentation. And then I want to really focus in on some micro and practical, pragmatic views of neurodiversity, particularly as pertains to special education. The two books that we're using for this course are my two books on neurodiversity. The first one is The Power of Neurodiversity, Unleashing the Advantages of Your Differently Wired Brain, and that's focused mostly on adult neurodiversity. And my book, Neurodiversity in the Classroom, Strength-Based Strategies to Help Students with Special Needs Succeed in School and Life. And that book is more applicable to kindergarten through 12th grade education. Okay, first the macro view. I wanted to situate neurodiversity within the larger context of diversity. And I liked this particular diagram, although it was missing biodiversity, and so I decided to put it in myself. And I put it in the center because it seems that biodiversity is really foundational. It's really talking about the diversity of life, the foundation that allows us to have life and to have good lives. And that funnels into all the different forms of diversity that exist among human beings as individuals or as groups. And looking at the different kinds of diversity, we can situate neurodiversity as one part of the disability paradigm, although there's a part of me that would like to make it a separate slice, so to speak. But then we need to relate it and understand that it is part and parcel with other forms of diversity. Sexual orientation, for example. There are a lot of connections between neurodiversity and the LGBTQ movement. Religious diversity, honoring the different traditions and the different ideas that there are different paths to the truth. Gender diversity, something that we think now of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's worked so tirelessly on behalf of women to give them legal equity in the culture. And age, being able to listen to our elders. In fact, to any stage of life. I've actually written a book called The Human Odyssey. And in that book, I suggest that every stage of life, and I have 12 stages of life, offers a particular gift to humanity. Elders offer us wisdom. Babies offer us vitality. Early childhood offers us playfulness, and so forth. And so being open and awake to the wonders and diversities of different ages can be a whole new way of appreciating diversity. Of course, race and ethnicity being a very important part and a very controversial part of our culture right now, with so much emphasis on the one hand, a racist approach to life, and on the other hand, an honoring of all races. Cultural diversity, very much the same thing, honoring different cultures for what they have to give us. And then finally, disability diversity. And when we look at all these different kinds of diversity, first of all, one of the things that struck me was they all have obstacles in their way, usually in the form of human attitudes. So with sexual orientation, that becomes homophobia. For gender, it becomes sexism. For age, it becomes ageism. For race, it becomes racism. For disability, it becomes ableism. The idea that if you are normal, you would walk on the sidewalk and not need to use a wheelchair. That kind of, approach, this sort of normal-centric approach to life. So I just wanted to have in this summing up presentation a kind of a big picture view to remind us that neurodiversity forms a part of a larger picture of diversity that we really are fighting for when we fight for neurodiversity. When we look at all of the other rights movements for greater respect for LGBTQ communities, for different religious traditions, for men and women equity, for different age groups, for different races, we're really looking at the same kind of fight, which is really going into ourselves and developing an ethos of respect and regarding different diversities with a great deal of honor and integrity. So that's just what I wanted to say about the macro view of neurodiversity. Now I want to spend the rest of my presentation focusing on the micro view. In the readings this week, there was an article I wrote for Educational Leadership where I focused on how neurodiversity suggests that we need to completely restructure our concept of what special education is. And I have a chart in there that looks at both the deficit-based and strength-based components that should exist or have existed in special ed. So the focus in a deficit-based special education program is diversity, strength-based approach, is disability, a strength-based approach is diversity. The assessment methods for deficit-based are testing for deficits, strength-based are assessing strengths and challenges. Instructional approaches for the deficit-based is remediating weaknesses, and for the strength-based is building on strengths and using those strengths to overcome challenges. Some of the theoretical foundations of traditional special education are genetics and neurobiology, as well as, I probably should add, behaviorism. A strength-based approach relies more on findings from evolutionary psychobiology and social and ecological theory. The view of the brain in a deficit-based special education program is of a brain that's damaged, dysfunctional, and or disordered, whereas a strength-based approach is viewing that brain as part of natural human variation. The program goals of a traditional special education program are meeting instructional objectives. This is certainly a part of the strength-based approach, but the wider view is that ultimately we want to be helping to develop the potential of each individual within the special education system. And finally, the way we explain to students about their difference or their disability also differs. The deficit-based approach tends to take a learning to live with your disability kind of approach, whereas a strength-based approach involves more of a learning to maximize your strengths and minimize your weaknesses kind of approach. Now, there's some formidable obstacles to change, to systemic change, the kind of systemic change that I suggested in this chart that we have to confront, that I did write about in that Educational Leadership article. One of the biggest challenges is the simple, pragmatic, administrative need for a disability label. This is a chart showing the number of the percentages of how many, from year to year, how many nationally, how many kids have been enrolled in special education. And then the blue line is how many people in Texas. And the article that this was taken from was basically an article that said, we're not finding enough special education students. We're under our quota. We should be finding more kids with special education needs. So there's that push. There's also that push in advocacy groups, whether it be dyslexia or autism. There are campaigns to raise awareness about the disabling features of each of these categories. And, you know, I put it this way, nobody's going to get funding for a disability that has too many gifts in it. That might be saying it too bluntly, but I think the idea is oftentimes there seems to be a term management issue in advocacy groups where they need to make the disability not too severe, or people will get scared and not want to have their child identified in that way. And they can't make it too nice, too good, too flowery, or people won't give money, because who's going to give money for something that's not a disability in this case? So how do we get around that? I want to suggest what seems like a simple solution, although it might be easier said than done, and that is having a two-pronged approach. We should use if we have to, and it seems like pragmatically we have to use a deficit paradigm to get kids into the special education programs. So when it comes to qualifying for special ed, let's use the deficit paradigm. Let's use the instruments, the deficit instruments that need to show there is, you know, significant discrepancies between achievement and potential, for example. But once the child is in the special education program receiving the services, let's switch tactics and use a strength-based paradigm. It's kind of a stealth approach in a way. The deficit paradigm can be loudly proclaimed and obviously part of the administrative data collection, whereas the strength-based paradigm is the way things are practiced, the reality of the situation on the ground. And this probably, and most definitely actually, does go on in our schools right now, I think. There's so many teachers who are using strength-based practices without even necessarily knowing that they're doing that, or not perhaps giving them the level of importance that they deserve. But at any rate, that's kind of an approach for meeting both the needs of the child, who needs that strength-based approach, and the needs of the administrators and fundraisers, who really need to highlight the deficit aspects of each individual diversity. A second challenge to systemic change is what I call chasing normality. Here we have the STAR results. I think this is from California, showing achievement levels for special education students and non-special education students. And you can see the blue bar does not come up to the orange one. And this is what often concerns, in fact, usually concerns most special education teachers and parents. They want their kids to achieve at the same level as anybody else. And they don't want to, and this is the interesting thing, they want the child to be tested just as any other student is tested. So they really are emphasizing their desire that their child approach normality in terms of test results as much as they can. So this puts a lot of pressure on teachers. I mean, there are already pressures on teachers to improve test results for neurotypical kids. So for neurodiverse kids who will many times have significant greater difficulty achieving those kinds of results, this puts on added pressure, which means that the special ed teacher is going to focus most of their time on helping to bring that child up to grade level, or as close to grade level, or to the testing normality rate as everyone else. Now, the solution that I've worked out, and I've said this in different ways in the course, and I would like to say it one last time in a kind of a clear way, and that is that there's two kinds of successes that we should focus on when we're working with neurodiverse kids. The first I call adaptive success. This is helping kids adapt to the world around them, teaching the autistic child to socialize to some extent, to as much extent as they can, teaching the dyslexic to read, teaching the ADHD kid to attend and focus. So that's, important that we give them those kind of skills. But it's also important that we give kids what I call integral success. And this is really what we're talking about with positive niche construction. It's changing the environment to meet the needs of the child so that child can grow according to their own gifts and according to their own terms. And ultimately, true success is a combination of the two. It's adaptive success plus integral success equals 100% success. We know we've covered all our bases when we've helped the child to grow according to his own terms, and we've also given them skills to make it easier for them to interact with the outside world or with the world of neurotypicals. Next, I want to talk about some specific applications that we can use to help make systemic change in special education more likely to occur. And some of them are easily implemented and others perhaps are more dreams. This first one may be more of a dream, but not really, because in a sense, we're doing that right now. And that is the idea of creating a new role in a school district or in an individual school. We've got resource room teachers, we've got co-teachers, we've got support staff, and this would be in that realm, but it would be explicitly related to neurodiversity. And I suggest that every school and every district have a neurodiversity strengths specialist. Here are some of the qualifications that a neurodiversity strengths specialist should have. First, they should be familiar with the strength-based literature. That's the literature that we looked at early in the course when we looked at Maslow and Steiner and Carl Jung, and we looked at the positive psychology movement and so forth. So it's really understanding that literature, the broader literature, first, and then developing a familiarity with the literature on strengths in special education populations. And this, of course, subsumes the material that we've been reading in this course, including this article by Motron, The Power of Autism. Another competency would be the ability to use a wide range of strength-based assessment tools. The Torrance tests of creative thinking, for example. The Devereaux student strengths assessment. The behavioral and emotional rating scale called the BERS by Michael Epstein. The Clifton Youth Strengths Explorer. Also, the neurodiversity strength specialist would have the ability to look at existing deficit-based oriented assessments and instruments and be able to interpret them in terms of strengths. For example, this is a chart showing some subtests from the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. And you can look at block design, which we've noted as an indicator of visual spatial intelligence, and picture completion being particularly, and object assembly being particularly emphasized in this profile of this student. So being able to read deficit-based instruments according to the strengths that they can reveal in their subtests. The neurodiversity strength specialist would also have a competence in using a variety of informal strength-based assessment approaches. That would include observation of kids, being able to catch students doing their strengths essentially, the ability to document what they see through photos, through anecdotal writing, through audio files, video files, and so forth. Their ability to look over a student's cumulative files and find the strengths that are there. I used to actually do this when I was a consultant in New York State. I would go into a school district and ask them to give me the cum file for a child they wanted some information on in terms of multiple intelligences. And what I do is have a copy of the cum file, and I go through it and I highlight with a yellow marker anything that had to do with strengths, whether it be the highest test scores or grades or the comments made by teachers. And then I would take all that yellow highlighted information and type it up together and hand it out during IEP meetings and other meetings about the student. And this would really make a change. All of a sudden, people would be looking at a strength-based profile. And this really had an effect. They began to think, well, now that you mention it, they do this very well. And now that you point that out, yes, it's true, they do that. And they start to gather all their strength-based memories of this individual, and they begin to essentially construct a new image of the child rather than the typical deficit one that seems to hover like a dark cloud over many IEP meetings. Being able to consult with colleagues and get information from them, other teachers and other support personnel about what they've observed in the strengths of a student. Consulting with parents, maybe sending home parents with a checklist, maybe with the neurodiversity skills checklist, and then having the ability to sit down with students and ask them about their strongest intelligences, for example. Michael Epstein, who developed the BERS that I just talked about, has what he calls a strength chat for children. And these are just a series of questions that help to elicit ideas that students have about their strengths, about their abilities. Name 2 good things about your parents. What is your favorite hobby? Tell me about your classes. What's your favorite class? What do you like most about your friends? What's your favorite musician, sport, person? If you said one good thing about yourself, what would it be? Simple questions, but that can really evoke from the child their own sense of and perception of themselves as a gifted person, essentially. Essentially, then, this neurodiversity strength-based specialist would be responsible for assessing, both formally and informally, both quantitatively and qualitatively, strengths in students in special education. Then she'd be responsible for going in and consulting and actively working with the regular class teacher, with the co-teacher if there is one, with the assistants if they're there, and also consulting with administrators and basically advocating for the students' abilities, actually helping to build a strength-based picture so that the strategies, and this is another competency that I left out of the chart, but they should have the ability to develop curricula, particularly strength-based strategies that can use those strengths that they've assessed and help that child learn in their areas of need more effectively. And so that's, they would go into the classroom and demonstrate some of these strength-based strategies and help the teacher to develop their own repertoire of strategies. A second practical application to help us nudge special education programs towards some kind of significant change would be to change the way we do IEP meetings. And that would involve using appreciative inquiry. If you'll remember back to our strength-based models module, we talked briefly about appreciative inquiry, developed by a man named Cooperrider. And this was first used in the business field, but now has been applied to education. And in particular, a gentleman named Peter Kozik took appreciative inquiry and applied it directly to establishing protocols for an IEP meeting. So in the IEP meeting, the first order of business essentially is to ask the student. Of course, the student would be there, an important part of having a strength-based IEP meeting. Tell us about some of your successes this year. What have you done well? What has worked well for you? Asking the same thing to the parent. What have you seen your child doing successfully this year? Same thing with the teachers and specialists. And then to the group, what suggestions can you think of to make the students' program work even better? So we're not talking about bemoaning the fact that we didn't meet all our goals this last term. It's about looking at what worked and how to make it work better. The second protocol in this model is to focus on goals. To ask the student, what would you most love to do when you grow up? What do you think you'll need to do to get what you want to do in life? What have you done so far to get there? And then to ask the same thing to the group. What kind of support and help can we provide? Here we're talking about positive niche construction to make the student's program work toward the goals that he or she has set for him or herself. There's a strong element of student voice in this particular protocol on IEPs. Another simpler and more easily applied approach to bringing neurodiversity into schools and districts would be to have a neurodiversity day, a neurodiversity week, or even a university month or year. Many groups have celebrated Neurodiversity Pride Day. This one takes place on May 19th. Some people celebrate neurodiversity on Autism Pride Day on June 18th. But regardless of what time, what day of the year it appears on, here's a school district in Canada that's had a Neurodiversity Day. These can be days when individuals, kind of like a science fair, create projects or show the projects that they've been working on. A day when there are displays related to positive role models, assistive technologies, where all the tools of positive niche construction can be shown and even demonstrated, and where there can be an honoring, not just of neurodiverse kids, but of all kids, of the diversity, the diverse minds in all kids. And it would be great if every school had a day like this every year. Another way of integrating neurodiversity into the existing status quo would be linking neurodiversity to existing diversity programs in schools. Many, if not most schools today have some kind of diversity program that focuses on racial, cultural, ethnic diversity. And we can use that as an opening to suggest other forms of diversity that be honored, including neurodiversity. We can also look, and very important that we do look at professional development. In particular, look at the inclusion component of professional development as an avenue for bringing in neurodiversity. We've talked about inclusion in different parts of this course, but it certainly bears repeating that if inclusion is to succeed in the regular classroom, then there has to be an understanding and an appreciation and a celebration of diversity and neurodiversity in particular. And so in any inclusion professional development seminar, this is a way that we should be able to, now I'm going to say sneak in, but that's really not the the feeling that I think needs to be given to it. Needs to be brought in as a central part of how to make inclusion work in the classroom. And each teacher then can be given some of the same kinds of skills, the ability to catch strengths. How do we catch strengths in the students? How do we learn to appreciate them as strengths? How do we communicate that we know these strengths to our students? How do we develop strength-based strategies? These are all skills that teachers must learn, and professional development is key here in terms of giving them the tools and then offering them the opportunity to practice those tools and get feedback in subsequent professional development meetings. Another way that we can apply neurodiversity to special ed, in I think a very dramatic way, is to build strengths into the IEP goal writing process. It's important to note that the federal law on developing an IEP says in developing each child's IEP, the IEP team shall consider, number one, the strengths of the child. It's written into the law. A strength-based approach to special education is written into the law. That means not just that we should do it, but that we must do it. Many states have individual forms that include a section called Present Levels of Academic Achievement and Functional Performance. And this is oftentimes an opportunity to enumerate and describe at length, if necessary, the strengths of the student. This is oftentimes given just a sort of a pro forma response, tries hard, sense of humor, perseveres, those kind of things that are so general that they really don't evoke a specific image of a child. Whereas once we've done our homework, once we've gathered the information about strengths, we can really lay it down here and make it part of a formal part, a legal part of that student's program. And finally, we should build strengths into the state standards, because the state standards are going to be dictating in large part what many of those IEP goals are going to be. And it turns out that the Common Core state standards issued a letter, I guess you'd have to say, that focuses on applications to students with disabilities. And I've highlighted some of the key phrases here. Supports and accommodations, unique needs of the student, individualized instruction, universal design for learning, presenting information in multiple ways, allowing for diverse avenues of action and expression. All this is basically saying we can use neurodiversity, we can use strength-based approaches throughout the entire IEP process. Just to take one example, one Common Core state standard for 7th graders is to compare and contrast a text to an audio, video, or multimedia version of the text, analyzing each medium's portrayal of the subject, e.g. how the delivery of a speech affects the impact of the words. So for example, if we have a child who's been diagnosed with autism, and we want to build in the idea of positive role models, we could have them watch Temple Grandin's famous TED Talk on neurodiversity and have her compare it to the text. The nice thing about YouTube is many of their videos have a written text that goes along with it, a text generator feature. So the student can look at both the video, the mass media or the multimedia, and the printed text and do the various things that are suggested in that goal. Finally, having come to the end of the course, I'd like you to visualize where you'd like to go now with your understanding of neurodiversity. How would you like to apply it further in your own personal and/or professional life? Just take a few moments to visualize or reflect on where you'd like to go with this. Thanks so much for spending the last 10 weeks with me. You've been tremendous students. I've really enjoyed interacting with you and learning from your own experiences and background and your great ideas. It's enlivened me as a teacher, I hope, as much as it has you. So thanks again, and maybe we'll see you again sometime on another course. Take care. For further information, get my 2 books on neurodiversity. First of all, the power of neurodiversity, unleashing the advantages of your differently wired brain, and neurodiversity in the classroom, strength-based strategies to help students with special needs succeed in school and life.